This is Expat Sandwich. I'm Marty Walker. And this is our third installment of Culture Shock Flashback. If you're just joining us, it's basically where we flip Expat Sandwich on its head. We talk to a different group of expats, foreign nationals that have immigrated to the United States.
My name is Marian Lefeld, and I am from Caracas, Venezuela, and I moved here to the U.S. about 22 years ago.
Caracas is the capital as well as the largest city in Venezuela. It's located in a mountain valley just inland from the Caribbean and home to over 5 million people. Marian grew up on the coast of Venezuela.
Lecherías is not only a tiny little speck of a town, it's also on the eastern coast of Venezuela. I spent a lot of time in those islands and very close to the sea. My dad was an avid fisherman, and, we always just grew up on a boat and swimming and not having any kind of, restrictions in terms of space.
Marian's mother decided to move her to Caracas right at the beginning of high school.
Because typically you have to move to Caracas if you want to go to a better university. It was incredibly shocking. I had been in Caracas countless times, but I didn't know my way in the city. I didn't know it very well. And it's also very dense, and it's just sort of perched in this long and narrow valley. And, just the lack of being close to the sea was, a bit suffocating for me. Caracas, don't get me wrong, it's beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous. You have this enormous mountain that it kind of becomes the beacon for anyone and everyone that goes to the city. I was very lucky because I moved the year that the metro opened.
In total, the Caracas subway has about 40 miles of track, which is plenty for a teenager to explore the newness of moving to a big city.
I started skipping a lot of classes and hopping into the subway and going to places that I would normally wouldn't go.
This was in the early 80s when Venezuela hadn't yet experienced the full effects of the oil glut, and it was relatively safe to be exploring at that age. But then in 1989, things began to change.
There was the stability. There was democracy. We had elections, presidential elections every 5 years. We had an ongoing democracy for 40 years. We had a president called Carlos Andrés Pérez who wanted to implement sort of this new, sort of very pro-monetary fund measures to kind of lift the country out of debt, to kind of balance its budget a little bit better. One of the measures was actually to raise the price of gas. And what that triggered was what it's called now El Caracazo.
The Caracazo, which is the name of the city Caracas with the suffix azo added, which denotes a violent strike, and it translates as the big one in Caracas. Part of the mission of President Pérez was to diminish the role of the government in the economy. And part of that economic reform package was the elimination of the gas subsidies, which caused gas prices to rise by 100%, and in turn, the cost of public transportation increased by 30%. On February 27, 1989, massive rioting and looting broke out.
Especially the poorest sectors of the country, made them very angry, and they reacted in a terrible way. And, with this horrible destruction of the city. That was sort of contained in a few weeks. We had martial law for about a week. Of course, no school, curfews.
People even destroyed their own food markets. There was so much damage that their food distribution system was ruined. And by the time authorities responded to what was happening, citizens began firing weapons at officers, and so gunfire between police and citizens emerged. Total death numbers vary widely depending on who you talk to. The government reports that number to be around 300, while many others put it way above 2,000. Eventually, Perez revokes the gas hikes in order to restore normalcy, but the resentment and suspicion of the government continues. Venezuela has been all over the news lately for its political instability. In order to provide the context for Marian leaving the country, it sort of helps to understand how the country got to this point in the first place. Okay, so first, let's go way back to the 1800s. Venezuela was a Spanish colony until Napoleon invaded Spain in 1810, which turned out to be the perfect time for Venezuela to claim its independence from Spain. And for the next 100 years or so, the country was under various rulers and military dictators, and in 1935, Venezuela becomes the world's largest oil producer. During the late 40s, they began implementing democratic rule.
In the 50s, we had this incredible sort of surge of wealth. There was great infrastructure projects, and that today are sort of the main arteries in the cities, in terms of transportation and in terms of, basic infrastructure. And then there was also a lot of inequality, and that inequality was growing and growing by the hour.
And then Venezuela experienced its first big oil crash. And to make sure that never happened again, they joined OPEC, which was a group of oil-rich countries managing the global supply of oil. And if you lived or grew up during the 70s, you remember the long lines at the gas stations due to the oil embargo compliments of OPEC. Gas prices remained high for the rest of the decade, which was very good for Venezuela and not so good for the United States. But guess what happens in the 80s? There's too much oil on the market, which causes prices to drop, sending Venezuela's economy into a nosedive. Venezuelans are no longer living the good life. The country is plagued by riots, martial law, violence, and in the 90s, things got so bad, there were two different coup attempts. One happened to be led by Hugo Chavez.
In February 4th of 1992, I just remember clearly, Max and I had gone to the movie theater, and he dropped me off my house. He went home. He went very close to the presidential house, and, we saw like this very strange movement of soldiers. And all of a sudden, he goes on TV, and he is, on every TV set, of course we get phone calls. We're being awoken in the middle of the night, and we were told that there was a coup d'etat. But it was a failed coup d'etat, and Chavez appears on TV, sort of detained, but he was able to speak. And he said, "We did not accomplish our goals for now." And that phrase was very, very important, the "for now." In November of the same year, there's another coup d'etat. So then, this instability starts to emerge, right? After sort of all these years of democratic change of power and so on. So Max and I are sort of feeling this.
Chavez ended up being jailed for 2 years and then pardoned. A few years later, he's elected president after running on a social and populist economic platform.
We're starting to sort of look at each other. Okay, well, this doesn't look that good.
There were several factors that led them to deciding to move to the U.S. Besides political instability, crime was getting way worse.
One thing that happened to Max and I is that in the course of 3 years, we had 3 cars stolen. And that was very common to have, if you were going to a party, you couldn't leave your car on the streets. If you did, you always have to watch.
As luck would have it, Max was offered a job in Dallas.
So when the opportunity came up in 1995, we took it. So we moved to Dallas. We moved in the winter of 95. And I thought this was the ugliest place. Everything was brown. It was just so gloomy. The days being so short. Kind of a crazy thing to do. I moved and I was about 5 months pregnant with my first child, which was, a bad idea. Especially, you're having your first child and you don't have a network. That's hard. Of course, like everybody that comes here before even knowing, you're thinking about cowboys and, these huge Cadillacs with horns. And also, the show Dallas, of course, and JR, that's huge all over the world. I mean, it's not just Venezuela and then the U.S. It's also, the Tex-Mex culture that has been, it's prevalent when you move in a place like Texas.
And then there's the language issue.
Sometimes I felt so lost because I couldn't understand, when people were saying, using slang or saying things like, what a hassle. And I was like, what is a hassle?
And there's figuring out cultural nuances, some subtle, some not so much.
We had a lot of difficulty because we weren't expecting being here to be so hard. So, for example, to get credit, like we wanted to buy a car. He wanted us to pay everything in full. And I was like a little shocked. I'm like, I thought, if you have a job and if you, qualify, you could get a credit to buy a car. And he said, well, what warranty I have that you won't cross the border and take the car to Mexico? And I just remember just being so taken aback. I grew up knowing 3 races, black, white, and Asian. One thing that was very strange is when I went to the hospital and, I give birth to this child and I get this form, right, to fill out names and all that, fathers, blah, blah, blah. And then there was this question that I can never been able to forget, that it said race, what race? And here I am filling up this questionnaire in which they're asking me if I'm white, non-Hispanic, a native islander, southeast, blah, blah, blah. And then it had like 10 boxes that you could check. And then there was one box and it said other. And I remember clearly marking other. And on the line, I wrote down human. Man, that was just crazy. I've heard discussions about, we're in a post-racial society. I completely disagree. We're still kind of putting X's on boxes about what kind of race do you belong to. I mean, you could say it's for statistics, or you could say for, census or whatever. But the fact that it still exists, it tells you something about the temperature in the country.
Marian compares her experiences of attitudes towards immigration.
I mean, you have to think that Venezuelans did not leave the country. Venezuela always was sort of the receptacle of people from other countries who were having issues, who were having conflicts. I mean, the reason why my dad, who was born in the Basque Country, and his family, they immigrated to Venezuela in the 50s is, because of lack of opportunities in Spain, and they had opportunities in Venezuela. Lots of Latin Americans would come to Venezuela. We never left. You would leave the country for just a few years to either better your education. If you were pursuing a secondary degree or a higher degree, such as, a master's or PhD, the country would pay for you. You had to come back and work here. Venezuelans never actually emigrated. We always received people from other countries. And, we have sort of like this openness to others. And it was like, oh, okay, you're coming here. Yes. Come here. Mi casa es su casa. There was never sort of this sense of, oh, you're taking our jobs, or, the more the merrier. You're part of our family now.
After a year living in Dallas, Marian and Max moved back to Caracas. Max is in advertising and was working constantly on ad campaigns to expand Coca-Cola in Latin America. They weren't seeing each other hardly at all.
Another job offer came by, and we looked at each other and we're like, well, now we have a little bit of experience under our sleeve, and well, let's try this again. We came here with an HB1 visa for his job. I had the H4, which didn't allow me to work. I think we were a bit lucky that we came here before 9/11, that mess, because it has just complicated so much the whole immigration system. I mean, that's why we have so many illegal immigrants, because we don't have a legal immigrant program. And mind you, the H1 visa ties you in with the company that you're coming to work for. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. You have to do well, you have to do a good job. So you're kind of under a lot of pressure, because you don't have the option to leave unless the other company is willing to sponsor you.
And even though the second time around was easier for them living in Dallas, they watched from afar as conditions in Venezuela went from bad to worse, much worse.
If I could, I would just buy tickets for everybody and I would have everybody come here and live with me. That's sort of my fantasy. The reality is much more complicated. So I'll give you an example. I'm always sending stuff to Caracas. And one time, very recently, my sister called me to thank me that I had sent her some flour, just some white flour. And I could hear in her voice. And my sister sounded so grateful. Thank you so much. I'm just going to bake, I'm going to bake a cake for the kids. I'm so grateful. And I was just listening at her and just going, I started getting sort of anxious. And the next thing that came out of my mind is, I hope you don't get used to this. I hope you don't think that this is normal. This is not normal. And this has to pass. The fact that, she hadn't seen any white flour for a year.
The medical situation is dire. The Guardian reports 9,000 doctors have left the country. They say working in Venezuela is like being in a war zone. Hardly any medicine is available, and supplies like gloves are reused. There are reports of some patients waiting 6 months or more to have broken bones reset because there aren't any rods or pins or plates.
You know what? The situation there is just horrible. It was last there in November of last year. And this year we talked about going, and, with the strikes and the protests, and then the airlines also started pulling out. So we decided to go to Mexico, spend a few days in Mexico. I have a cousin who lives in Cancun, so, great to be with family. But Max and I spent a big part of our trip pharmacy hopping. We had these long lists of medicines that we had to buy for our parents, for our siblings. I had a suitcase full of drugs, legal drugs, but drugs nonetheless. First of all, because the health system here is absolutely crazy here in the U.S., right? I mean, you practically need a prescription to buy aspirin. And in Mexico, you can buy pretty much anything. I bought my mom a year's supply of the meds that she needs, and Max did that with his parents. And, we just little by little have been sending.
And here's what's been going on just this year. The Supreme Court, which is stacked with Maduro loyalists, took over legislative powers from the elected National Assembly, which is dominated by the president's opponents. A referendum was held. Many say it was rigged, but the vote passed, allowing the Supreme Court to create a new legislative body called the National Constituent Assembly. And that consisted of, you guessed it, all Maduro supporters, including Maduro's wife and son. And it has carte blanche to rewrite Venezuela's constitution and expand Maduro's executive powers. And it's this body that will replace the current opposition party in the National Assembly. Many countries, including the United States, are not recognizing the validity of the election and calling it a power grab. Some are even calling it the largest electoral fraud in Latin American history. So how did something like this even pass in the first place? Well, Venezuela is known for its high voter turnout, which is usually around 70%. But this time, the opposition boycotted the vote by staying home. Venezuela's state workers, like 3 million of them, were threatened by the government of losing their jobs if they didn't vote. And the poor, whose very existence depends on social benefits, they were warned they could lose access to food and government housing if they didn't turn out to vote. So in the end, Maduro claimed that the referendum had a 40% turnout, while the opposition claimed only 12% voted. So, how do you go from a highly prosperous democracy towards dictatorship? Here's a partial list of events that should probably signal some red flags. First, you have a deteriorating economy, or one that suffers from huge economic swings. You have a giant divide between rich and poor. You throw political opponents in prison, and you postpone government elections in order to stave off threats to your party's power. You repeatedly attack the judiciary branch and the free press, and you stack the courts and replace the legislative body with loyalists. And like Turkey's President Erdogan, you use crisis as an excuse to strengthen executive power while leaving the shells of your country's democratic institutions intact. And then, when your country's economic crisis has the opposition backing you into a corner, you pack your administration with members of the military.
That polarization, that them against us, that's something that I see echoing here in the U.S. and worries me. That we cannot have rational discussions. The hostility that I've seen, it's just something I have never encountered before. Not coming from such high echelons of power, right? Not coming from the office. This polarization, it brings me great anxiety. Also, because that's how, that's one of the strategies that Chavez used. Divide and conquer. Soon after, moving here, especially that second time, I just have this deep sadness that kind of feels like this great weight. I don't feel it that much nowadays. I think partly because I've kind of dried up a little bit. So for many years, people who've asked me or have told me, oh, how lucky you are that you left so many years ago. How lucky you are that you have been able to make a living in Dallas or in the U.S. or, you're safe, which is an incredible, simplistic way to put it, right? The immigration, it's not easy. It's complicated and it is incredibly painful. I am Venezuelan. I will always be Venezuelan. Also have sort of the pain, the added layer of not being able to go back because of what's happening right now. I think I've been able to sort of make this my place, but I'll never be from here. I mean, to this day, people ask me, oh, you have an accent. Where are you from? It's like, you're not from here. It's kind of a reminder. Nobody's doing it on purpose. It's not something I take personally, of course, but it's there.
I was curious to know what she missed about Venezuela.
In spite the great hardships, there's still this sense of joy and enjoyment in my family, in my people. And by the way, I love Thanksgiving. Don't get me wrong. But in Venezuela, you have it once a year. In Venezuela, you have it every Sunday. And then you add music, and then you dance. But I think there's still some balance between work and family life and having enough free time to enjoy. The culture here, it's not easy. I remember, thinking, boy, I have never worked harder in my life than when I moved here. People here work a lot. You work a lot. Too much, in my opinion.
Ask Marian what she loves about living in the United States.
Talking about the opportunities of the U.S., I don't think I would have been able to do what I've done here, going to school later in life and with scholarships and then getting scholarships to go to get my master's. And then, it's something that kind of like only in America. It would have been very, very difficult for me to do it in Venezuela. When I think about that and when I think about having been able to study here and to work hard and do well and get access to these great resources, that's something that I feel, wow, very fortunate to have had. The school that I went to, which is SMU, which it's incredibly expensive. It's something I could have not afforded. And yet it has an incredible endowment and it gives out a lot of money to students. Of course, you have to have, a high GPA. You have to do the work.
Marian is now a practicing artist and teaches art classes at a community college here in Dallas.
People here are incredibly generous. Here, museums and cultural institutions rely on the generosity of, the rich. It's not perfect, but there's a reason why we have so many students coming from abroad to study here. And of course, the whole Make America Great Again. When wasn't it great? When hasn't been great? This is a great country. I find that phrase so offensive. When I moved here, I knew of, the opportunities. I knew that it had, an imperfect democracy, by all means, and that's how it should be. I knew that there was a bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy works. You can disagree with me, but if you're giving a timeline that your passport is going to arrive, within 1 or 2 weeks, and that passport arrives, to me, it's a country that works. In fact, one thing that I have used in the past, when someone has sort of not followed through with a project or, I always say, that's so un-American. It really shocks me and surprised me when somebody doesn't, follow through. It feels like I'm back in Venezuela where people are telling you, yeah, we'll install this tomorrow. Yeah, we'll show it up tomorrow. And then people don't show up. So anyhow, this is a great country filled with opportunities. Is it perfect? Of course not.
That's going to wrap it up for us. If you'd like to see some of Marian Lefeld's artwork, you can visit marianlefeld.com. That's Marian, Lefeld, Lefeld.com. And like always, we'll have all of this and more in our show notes on our website at expatsandwich.com. Thanks to Patreon members Louise Walker, Tim Hurst, Jay Shen, and @Honorable Husband. We are incredibly appreciative of your generous support. And if you're a fan of the show and want to know how you can help us out, head on over to patreon.com/expatsandwich to make a donation. You can also leave us a review on iTunes. I got to say, It's really nice to get feedback from our listeners. And many thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate you. Expat Sandwich is produced by Marty Walker.